Hello, this is Helen from the Wise Owl Partnership. I'd like to give you a brief introduction to our reserves calculator, which is a tool to enable any charity to calculate an appropriate level of reserves and prepare a robust reserves policy. The purpose of this demo is to give you a flavour of the calculator and what it can do. Many charities keep reserves as a financial buffer against unexpected events happening, but find it difficult to work out how much is the right amount to set aside. One simple method of setting a reserves policy is to take total expenditure over a 12-month period and hold reserves that would cover a given number of months. For some charities, this may be a perfectly adequate approach, but it doesn't take account of the varying levels of risk associated with different types of income and expenditure. This can result in a charity either holding too little in reserve, leaving it potentially exposed, or too much in reserve, which is money that could be put to better use. There is also increasing evidence that potential funders want to see that charities have a well thought out reserves policy in place before they will award a grant or commission services. The reserves calculator helps you to take a risk-based approach to setting a reserves policy and incorporates the principles contained in the Charity Commission's guidance about reserves into a spreadsheet with instructions on how to complete. This enables you to set your charity's reserves level, monitor your reserves, and if need be, make changes over time. If your charity's circumstances change, the calculator will recalculate your target reserves for you. So let's take a look at the calculator, which is made up of 5 separate pages labelled Income, Expenditure, Restricted Funds, Additional Funds and Reserves. Now don't panic thinking you've 5 pages of data to enter, because some data is automatically transferred from one table to another. For the purposes of this demo, imagine that we are running a community arts charity. Let's start by looking at the income table. To save time, we've already completed the table with details of our charity's income. We've entered the dates between which we wish to forecast our income and expenditure, and listed all of our income sources and the amounts we expect to receive as either restricted or unrestricted funds. You'll see that we have given each source of restricted income an alphabetical reference. By referencing each item of restricted income, the calculator will automatically transfer our restricted income to our restricted funds analysis table. That's because we are limited on how we can spend restricted income and cannot divert it from funding one thing to another as we are able to with unrestricted funds. We therefore have to assess restricted income and in turn the expenditure that it funds separate to unrestricted income. We'll take a look at the restricted funds table later. We have risk scored each individual source of income using a 4x4x4 risk assessment model to arrive at an income reliability score. As you can see, each one is automatically colour-coded as either green, meaning high reliability, amber for medium reliability, or red for low reliability. I won't take you through the details of the risk scoring process, as this is covered in the full instructions that come with the calculator. I will just point out that if we hover our mouse over each of the risk headings, we see a pop-up box that prompts us as to how to score each risk. Note here that we have listed a local authority grant with reference A, which we have risk scored as high reliability. Now let's take a look at the expenditure table. Again, to save time, we've already typed in our forecast items of expenditure and entered their amounts according to whether they are to be funded from restricted or unrestricted funds. We have risk scored each item of expenditure using the 4x4x4 model, but using different criteria to arrive at an expenditure commitment score for each. If we had to reduce our expenditure, this tells us which we consider to have the lowest priority and which the highest. You'll see there are 2 items of expenditure from restricted income, which we have referenced A. This is because they are funded from the local authority grant we referenced A on the income table. If we now click on our restricted funds tab, we can see that the calculator has automatically transferred all of our restricted income to the income side of the table, and that the local authority grant has been correctly listed as having high reliability. If we look across to the expenditure side of the table, we can see that the calculator has transferred all of our items of expenditure from restricted funds to the table and aligned them with the sources of restricted income from which they are funded. In this example, drama workshops and art exhibitions, although having different levels of commitment, are both shown as being paid for out of our local authority grant. If we look at the final three columns in the table, funds needed to cover expenditure, this shows us that if we wanted to set our reserves level to only cover our high or medium and high commitment expenditure, then we wouldn't need reserves to cover these two items. That's because they are funded from income which has high reliability. It's only if we wanted to cover all of our expenditure that we would need to set aside reserves for these items. Now let's move to the Additional Funds tab, where we list any designated funds and additional funds we need to set aside. Designated funds are funds that we want to set aside to pay for planned expenditure that falls outside of our forecast period. Designated funds are excluded from our reserves calculation, but the Charity Commission guidance says we need to explain them in our reserves policy, so we've included them here. We have entered the amount we need to set aside as designated funds, the amount we already hold, and when we expect to spend it. Although it's not strictly necessary to risk score designated funds for the purpose of our overall reserves calculation, it does give us a guide as to the importance of this future expenditure. This could be helpful if we ever needed to reassess our spending commitments and possibly redirect all or some of our designated funds into financing something else. Additional funds are funds that we want to set aside to cover any possible but uncertain expenditure within our forecast period. We might want to think of it as a contingency fund. We've entered the amount we want to set aside as additional funds and risk scored each in the usual way. Finally, we come to the sharp end of the reserves calculator, where all of the figures we have entered are brought together to calculate the actual amount of reserves our charity needs. So let's click on the Reserves tab and briefly run through the reserves table. We can see that the calculator has transferred the totals from the other four tables and listed them under three columns: high commitment, medium and high commitment, and all expenditure, with the familiar red, amber, green colour coding. Where we have a blank cell, it means that the calculation has defaulted to 0. You'll see that the calculator has arrived at a subtotal of reserves that we need to hold, depending on the level of expenditure commitment we wish to cover. So for example, if we decide to set our reserves level to only protect our charity's high commitment expenditure, we refer to the figures in the red column. However, it's possible that our charity has access to other funds or assets that could be drawn upon if required, which could mitigate the need to hold reserves, or at least reduce the level of reserves we need. So we've entered the relevant amounts here, together with a short description for each. The calculator deducts the total amount of funds we could draw upon from our reserves subtotal to give us a target level of reserves needed. Notice that our high commitment expenditure column has defaulted to 0 and is therefore blank. Our charity is already holding reserves, so we have entered the amounts here, and the calculator has deducted one from the other to tell us if we have a reserve surplus or need to put aside more. As we can see, we could have a reserves deficit or surplus depending upon the level of expenditure commitment we decide to protect. There is, however, one final decision we need to make. We may want to set our reserves level to cover our expenditure for less than our forecast period, or we could allow our reserves level to fluctuate within a target range. We can do this in the last two tables. We can choose any combination of months and expenditure commitment level we want. In our example, we've decided that we will set our reserves to cover our medium and high commitment expenditure for between 6 and 8 months. The calculator shows us a lower limit and a higher limit that we need to set aside. The calculator deducts the amount of reserves we currently hold from our higher limit and shows us in this example that we have a reserves deficit. We will need to explain how we propose to fund this deficit in our charity's reserves policy, and conversely, if we were holding a reserve surplus, we would explain how we propose to spend the surplus if we so choose. The calculator comes with a reserves policy template, which is very simple to complete because we have already made many of the key decisions when using the calculator. The calculator also provides us with an invaluable tool to monitor our reserves level throughout the year. By simply updating our entries as we would a cash flow analysis, the calculator will tell us if we are on track to keep within our chosen reserves level. And one last thing, the calculator and template can be used time and again. I'm Helen Hinchliffe from the Wise Owl Partnership. I hope that you have found this brief introduction to our reserves calculator helpful. If you are interested in purchasing the calculator, please visit our website at www.thewiselpartnership.co.uk. Thank you for watching.